On television, he was the model of the Black America's dad, masculine, steadfast, with a beautiful wife and a good child. But behind that perfect facade was a secret he was willing to trade his life to hide. He had sex with men. In the 1990s, for a black actor, being exposed as LGBT would not only destroy his career, but also bring disgrace to his entire family. So, when AIDS knocked on his door, he made a desperate decision to slowly die on set while his PR team lied to the world that he simply had kidney failure. What truth was forced into silence? Larry Riley was born on June 20th, 1952, in Memphis, Tennessee. Riley was raised within a middle-class black family. In this specific demographic during this era, survival and upward mobility depended heavily on a strict social code. Historians and sociologists refer to this as the politics of respectability. This was not merely a set of manners, it was a rigorous defensive survival strategy. The doctrine dictated that to navigate a society built on white supremacy, black individuals had to be morally unassailable. They had to be impeccably dressed at all times. They had to be highly educated. They had to speak with perfect diction. The underlying unspoken rule was clear. Do not give the hostile system a single excuse to demean, arrest, or destroy you. For a young boy like Larry Riley, this environment placed an enormous psychological burden on his shoulders from the moment he could understand social dynamics. He was not just a child. He was expected to be an ambassador for his race. The margin for error was non-existent. A public mistake, a moment of loud anger, or a lapse in perfect behavior was not viewed as a simple childhood flaw. It was viewed as a dangerous liability. This continuous pressure to perform excellence created a profound internal split. There was the public self, carefully curated and always on guard. Then there was the private self, where the natural anxieties, fears, and complexities of youth were forced to be buried deep out of sight. This fragile illusion of safety through perfection was violently shattered during Riley's teenage years. The year 1968 marked a profound turning point in American history, and the epicenter of that trauma was Riley's hometown. Throughout the early months of that year, Memphis was paralyzed by the sanitation workers' strike. Black men, demanding basic human dignity and fair wages, marched through the streets wearing stark, powerful placards reading, "I am a man." The atmosphere in the city was incredibly tense, volatile, and heavily militarized. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. A sniper's bullet ended his life. Larry Riley was 16 years old. The assassination of Dr. King in his own city was a paradigm-shifting event for the teenager. He witnessed the immediate aftermath. He saw the grief, the rage, and the subsequent riots that tore through the city. The psychological impact of this event cannot be overstated. Dr. King was the ultimate symbol of the respectability politics Riley had been raised on. King was highly educated, impeccably dressed, articulate, and deeply moral. Yet none of those attributes protected him from a violent death. For a highly perceptive 16-year-old, the lesson was clear and terrifying. If the system could murder a man as perfect as Dr. King, then no amount of good behavior, no amount of perfect diction, and no amount of middle-class respectability could truly guarantee safety for a black man in America. The shield was an illusion, the realization that he was inherently vulnerable regardless of his achievements deeply embedded a sense of paranoia and a heightened need for self-preservation. It was within this pressure cooker of social expectation and profound historical trauma that Riley discovered his escape route. He found sanctuary in the performing arts. At Melrose High School, a segregated institution with a proud history of academic and athletic excellence, Riley began participating in theater. The stage offered something the streets of Memphis could not, a controlled environment. Through acting, Riley found a safe, sanctioned space to release the emotions he was forced to suppress in his daily life. When he stepped onto a stage, he was no longer a young black man carrying the heavy burden of respectability. He could inhabit different personas. He could express rage, sorrow, joy, and vulnerability without real-world consequences. The script provided a protective barrier. If he cried on stage, it was the character crying, not Larry. If he shouted, it was the dialogue, not a dangerous outburst. Theater became his primary coping mechanism. It was the ultimate mask. He possessed a natural, immense talent characterized by a deep, resonant voice and a commanding physical presence. He honed this craft meticulously. He learned how to manipulate an audience's perception. He learned how to project an exact image, how to hit the right emotional marks, and how to entirely conceal his true internal state behind a character. This early reliance on performance as a psychological shield shaped his entire future. After graduating from Melrose, he continued his theatrical training at Memphis State University. He immersed himself in dramatic literature and stagecraft. The university setting allowed him to refine his raw talent into professional skill. He was preparing for a career that would demand everything of him. He was learning the mechanics of illusion. He was mastering the art of being seen exactly how others wanted to see him, a skill that would eventually bring him wealth, fame, and ultimately a suffocating isolation. The boy from Memphis had learned how to act his way to survival. Now, he was ready to take that act to the most demanding stages in the world. In 1988, the American broadcasting landscape was not a platform for progressive social experiments. It was a highly conservative, risk-averse corporate machine designed for a single purpose: to deliver specific demographics to advertisers. The Reagan era had cemented a cultural preference for traditional family values, and primetime soap operas were the ultimate vehicle for selling that ideology. Shows like Dallas Dynasty and Knots Landing dominated the Nielsen ratings by offering audiences a glossy, heavily sanitized version of American life. When the producers at Lorimar Television decided to introduce the Williams family to Knots Landing in its 10th season, it was heralded by the press as a landmark moment for diversity. In reality, it was a calculated financial maneuver. The network executives recognized a burgeoning black middle-class consumer base that advertisers wanted to reach. However, integrating a predominantly white, fiercely loyal viewing audience required surgical precision. The new black characters could not afford to be complicated, edgy, or controversial. They had to be the absolute antithesis of the negative, threatening stereotypes that frequently dominated the evening news cycle. They needed a patriarch who radiated safety, stability, and unshakable morality. They found their perfect asset in Larry Riley. Fresh off his critical successes in New York theater and film, Riley possessed a booming, authoritative voice and a commanding yet deeply accessible physical presence. He was cast as Frank Williams, a former police officer who moves his family into the exclusive Seaview Circle under the Witness Protection Program. The character was designed to be fundamentally decent, fiercely protective of his wife and daughter, and entirely non-threatening to his affluent white neighbors, but making the transition from a respected stage actor in New York to a primetime network star in Los Angeles required Riley to sign a covert contract with the Hollywood machinery. The theater world, while imperfect, historically offered a degree of bohemian tolerance for artists' private lives. Television, conversely, operated under a regime of strict corporate surveillance. When an actor signed onto a massive CBS drama, the network was not merely leasing their talent for 12 hours a day, they were purchasing the actor's entire public existence. This ownership was legally enforced through the morality clause, a standard feature in studio contracts dating back to the golden age of Hollywood. The morality clause stipulated that an actor could be instantly fired if they engaged in any conduct that brought them into public disrepute, contempt, scandal, or ridicule, or if their actions shocked or offended the community. In the late 1980s, the definition of scandal was rigidly heteronormative. For any leading man, rumors of homosexuality were a career death sentence. For a black leading man, tasked with representing an entire demographic to a scrutinized national audience, the margin for error was absolutely zero. Any deviation from the script of the traditional straight family man would render him an immediate financial liability to the advertisers underwriting his paycheck. Consequently, Riley's off-screen life had to be aggressively managed to mirror the fictional perfection of Frank Williams. The PR strategy was clear: construct an impenetrable heterosexual shield. Riley's real-life marriage to his second wife, Nina, and his role as a father to their young son became crucial corporate assets. Publicists actively deployed his family unit to satisfy the media and reassure the network. Riley was frequently featured in prominent black publications like Ebony and Jet magazines. These profiles were meticulously curated to highlight his domestic stability. Photographers captured him in his home, smiling with his wife, projecting the exact image of the dependable provider he played on television. This was the Hollywood illusion operating at peak efficiency. Every interview, every red carpet appearance, and every authorized photograph was a brick in a fortress built to keep the tabloids at bay. The marketing strategy relied on the public conflating Larry Riley the man with Frank Williams the character. The network was selling household cleaners, automobiles, and life insurance on the back of his presumed heterosexuality and wholesome domesticity. However, maintaining this illusion required immense psychological compartmentalization. Riley was trapped in a gilded cage. He had achieved the pinnacle of commercial success for a black actor in his era, securing a steady, highly lucrative job in an industry where unemployment is the norm. Yet the cost of that security was the absolute suppression of his private reality. The character he portrayed on screen was the only version of him the system would ever accept. The pressure to constantly perform the straight script did not end when the director called cut. It extended to industry parties, network executive dinners, and casual interaction with the crew. He had to meticulously police his mannerisms, his associations, and his off-hours behavior. In an era before social media, the paparazzi and tabloid journalists served as the aggressive enforcers of Hollywood's moral code. The National Enquirer and similar publications thrived on exposing the hidden lives of celebrities, particularly when those lives contradicted their wholesome public brands. For Riley, the fear of exposure was not abstract. It was a daily grinding reality. He understood the precarious nature of his position. He was a trailblazer, yes, but he was also entirely expendable. The Hollywood machinery was ruthless. If a scandal broke, if any whisper of an alternative lifestyle or unsavory associations reached the executive suites, CBS would not hesitate to invoke the morality clause. They would sever his contract, recast his role, or write out his family entirely, and permanently exile him from the lucrative world of network television. To survive in this high-stakes ecosystem, Riley had to become a master of misdirection. He had to project an aura of total normalcy while navigating a deeply complex, hidden internal landscape. The skills he had learned on the stages of Memphis, the ability to fully inhabit a persona, to survive a hostile environment, were now being tested on the largest, most unforgiving stage in the world. He was playing the role of a lifetime, not for awards or critical acclaim, but for his sheer professional and financial survival. But the machinery demands constant maintenance, and the psychological cost of living a 24-hour lie was beginning to exact a devastating toll on his health. The public narrative of Larry Riley's life was broadcast weekly to millions of living rooms, a sanitized projection of domestic tranquility. But beneath the surface of late 1980s, Los Angeles operated a complex, fiercely guarded underground ecosystem. For black men in the entertainment industry grappling with complex sexual identities, navigating this era required operating on two entirely different frequencies. The intense paranoia of this period stemmed from a very specific sociological trap constructed around black queer or bisexual men. The mainstream gay liberation movement, heavily centered in areas like West Hollywood, was predominantly white and often exclusionary, fraught with its own internal racial prejudices. Conversely, within many conservative segments of the black community, particularly those anchored by the traditional church, homosexuality was strictly condemned. It was viewed not merely as a sin, but as a direct threat to the hard-won image of black masculine strength that leaders had spent decades cultivating to counter racist caricatures. This dual marginalization meant there was no safe harbor. If an actor like Riley stepped out of the rigid heteronormative box, he faced a double excommunication: racial alienation from the gay community and homophobic rejection from his own cultural base. Consequently, a highly structured clandestine society flourished. It operated through coded language, private, unlisted parties, and strict vetting processes. In the industry, this was a precursor to what would later be broadly and often sensationally termed the down low. But in the context of 1980s Hollywood, maintaining a hidden life was not a deceitful game. It was a deeply fortified survival mechanism. It was an elaborate fortress built to protect one's family, one's career, and one's physical safety from a society hostile to their existence. The psychological toll of maintaining this fortress was staggering. Living a bifurcated life requires a state of hypervigilance. Every interaction, every phone call, and every social invitation had to be calculated. The fear of discovery was a constant low-grade hum. Actors in this position lived with the acute dread that a disgruntled assistant, an ambitious tabloid reporter intercepting their trash, or a jealous associate could dismantle their entire life with a single phone call to the National Enquirer. This relentless, invisible pressure cooker often manifested in severe imposter syndrome and an isolating, crushing loneliness, even amidst massive public adulation. By the late 1980s, the strain of this psychological tightrope act began to fracture Riley's defenses. The immense pressure of the CBS contract, the demands of his newly acquired fame, and the weight of his hidden realities converged. In May 1989, Riley checked into a rehabilitation facility. The public relations apparatus framed this as a proactive step to address exhaustion and substance abuse. Historically, within the high-stakes pressure of the studio system, substance abuse frequently functions not as a recreational indulgence, but as an active anesthesia. It is a desperate coping mechanism to numb the cognitive dissonance of living a relentless, 24-hour lie. However, the attempt to detoxify his body led to a catastrophic revelation. It was during this stint in rehab, stripped of his usual defenses, that Riley was subjected to routine medical screenings. The results delivered a fatal blow. He tested positive for HIV. In May of 1989, the clinical and social reality of an HIV diagnosis was apocalyptic. There were no highly active antiretroviral therapies. The available treatments, primarily high doses of AZT, were highly toxic and often debilitating. Beyond the physiological death sentence, AIDS carried the threat of a forced outing. The virus was inextricably linked in the public consciousness to the gay community and intravenous drug users. To contract the virus was, in the eyes of a prejudiced media and public, an immediate, unmasking admission of a hidden lifestyle. It is at this precise juncture that the historical record splinters into fiercely guarded competing narratives regarding the source of Riley's infection. The 50-50 rule of historical investigation demands acknowledging both the public defense and the private realities of the era. On one side stands the staunch defense of his family. His widow, Nina Riley, categorically stated years later that her husband was not a homosexual and did not use intravenous drugs. She maintained the firm belief that he contracted the virus through a previous heterosexual encounter, a tragic anomaly in an otherwise straight life. This narrative served to protect his legacy within the traditional parameters of the family unit he fought so hard to maintain. On the other side exists the persistent, unyielding reality of the Hollywood Whisper Network. Many close to the 1990s television scene, alongside industry insiders familiar with the era's underground culture, noted that Riley's diagnosis was viewed internally as a tragic confirmation of the open secrets surrounding his private life. It was widely understood within these inner circles that the intense heteronormative demands of the network forced many actors into the very shadows where the virus was spreading most rapidly. Regardless of which narrative holds the absolute biological truth of transmission, the structural outcome for Larry Riley remained identically devastating. He was a black leading man on a conservative network drama, diagnosed with the most stigmatized disease of the 20th century. If the truth leaked, he would instantly become a pariah. The diagnosis cornered him, forcing him to engage in a desperate, high-stakes negotiation with a system designed to exploit him. The moment the medical file confirmed his HIV status, the fundamental power dynamic between Larry Riley and his employers radically shifted. He was no longer just a star employee. He was a financial hostage to the American healthcare system and the Hollywood machinery. Riley's subsequent choices were driven by a terrifying pragmatism rooted entirely in the brutal economics of terminal illness in 1989. The early medications used to combat HIV and stave off full-blown AIDS were astronomically expensive. A single year's supply of AZT could cost upwards of $10,000, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to roughly $25,000 today. Furthermore, the intensive specialized medical care required to manage the inevitable opportunistic infections demanded premium, top-tier health insurance. For Riley, that vital lifeline of insurance was inextricably tied to his employment on Knots Landing. He was trapped in a lethal paradox. To survive the virus physically, he needed the world-class medical coverage provided by CBS. To keep that coverage, he had to keep his job. To keep his job, he had to guarantee that his employers and the public never found out he had the virus. The system that paid his salary also held the keys to his physical survival, creating a dynamic of absolute, terrifying dependency. Network television in the late 80s and early 90s operated with ruthless corporate efficiency. While a studio might publicly mourn a star who died in a tragic accident, they viewed a chronic, highly stigmatized illness as an unacceptable liability. The logistics of scheduling around an ailing actor, coupled with the profound fear of advertiser boycotts, if a star was associated with the AIDS crisis, meant that actors who disclosed their status were almost invariably and quietly written off their shows. The morality clause in his contract, designed to protect the network from scandal, was a loaded gun pointed directly at his career. Faced with the immediate threat of losing his income, his insurance, and his family's financial security, Riley and his inner circle architected a desperate, calculated medical lie. They could not hide the impending physical deterioration, but they could control the narrative surrounding it. They needed a disease that was serious enough to explain extreme weight loss, fatigue, and hospital visits, but sanitized enough to avoid the moral panic of the AIDS epidemic. The chosen cover story was high blood pressure resulting in severe renal failure. This fabrication was a masterstroke of survivalist public relations. High blood pressure was a highly common destigmatized ailment, particularly prevalent in the African American community. It drew empathy rather than suspicion. Renal failure provided a clinical explanation for the wasting syndrome that would soon ravage his body. Crucially, from a legal standpoint, firing an actor solely for developing a common, non-controversial organ failure would invite messy, highly public disability discrimination lawsuits. The lie effectively neutralized the network's ability to easily discard him, forcing them to honor the contract and keep the insurance active. However, executing this lie required the complicity of a massive silent apparatus. It required doctors willing to sign off on sanitized medical records for the studio. It required publicists willing to aggressively lie to persistent journalists. It required his family to endure the agonizing process of watching him die while vigorously denying the true nature of his killer. Riley became a prisoner of his own cover story. The network, whether genuinely ignorant or willfully blind, accepted the renal failure narrative. But by accepting the lie, the studio system tightened its grip on him. They had their assets secured. The advertisers were safe. The fictional world of Seaview Circle remained undisturbed. The corporate machine continued to generate millions in revenue, entirely insulated from the tragedy unfolding on its sound stages. Larry Riley had secured his insurance and his family's financial future, but the cost of that security was a mandate to suffer in absolute agonizing silence, completely at the mercy of the executives who signed his checks. He was locked into a contract that demanded he show up for work, no matter the physical cost, turning the set of his greatest triumph into the site of his slow, public execution. The agreement was struck, the medical records were sanitized, and the insurance policy was secured. But the sheer logistical execution of this lie transformed the sound stages of CBS into a daily agonizing gauntlet for Larry Riley. Deciding to hide an AIDS diagnosis in a boardroom is a matter of strategy. Physically hiding the progression of the virus under the intense scrutiny of a multi-camera television production is a feat of unimaginable endurance. The sheer physical toll of this cover-up was magnified by the grueling, relentless infrastructure of 1990s network television. Shows like Knots Landing operated on an industrial scale. A standard season consisted of 24 to 30 episodes requiring a relentless 9-month shooting schedule. Cast members were routinely subjected to 12 to 16-hour workdays. The environment itself was physically punishing. Sound stages were massive, cavernous warehouses, superheated by banks of massive tungsten lighting grids required for broadcast quality film. Into this high-pressure, physically demanding environment walked a man whose immune system was systematically collapsing. The progression of the human immunodeficiency virus, particularly before the advent of highly active antiretroviral therapy, was brutal and uncompromising. As the virus decimates the body's T cells, it strips away the fundamental ability to fight off even the most minor infections. This leads to a state of profound bone-deep exhaustion that cannot be alleviated by rest. Furthermore, one of the most visible and terrifying hallmarks of late-stage HIV infection in this era was AIDS wasting syndrome. This condition causes rapid involuntary loss of muscle mass and body fat. The body essentially begins to consume itself to survive. Riley was battling this aggressive biological reality while contractually obligated to portray a robust, healthy former police officer. The daily transformation required to bridge the gap between a dying man and the character of Frank Williams was an exercise in macabre theatricality. His day began in the makeup chair, long before the rest of the crew arrived. Makeup artists, bound by professional discretion and the studio's official narrative of kidney failure, went to work reconstructing his face. They applied heavy, thick layers of foundation and contouring to fill in the rapidly deepening hollows of his cheeks. They used color correctors to mask the pallor of a failing immune system. This was not the standard cosmetic enhancement of Hollywood. It was mortuary science applied to the living. The wardrobe department faced an equally grim task. As Riley's frame shrank, his clothes hung off him like a scarecrow. To maintain the illusion of Frank Williams's solid, imposing physique, the costume designers layered him in oversized shirts, heavy sweaters, and thick jackets, even when shooting scenes meant to take place in the sweltering Southern California summer. Riley was forced to stand under the boiling studio lights, suffocating under layers of wool and padding, trying to suppress the severe night sweats and temperature fluctuations symptomatic of his condition. The psychological burden of this daily ritual was immense. Every morning, Riley had to look in the mirror and watch his own mortality staring back at him, only to have it painted over and padded away by a production team desperate to keep the show on schedule. The cognitive dissonance of dying in private while being reconstructed for public consumption was enough to shatter the strongest of minds. This unbearable tension inevitably leads back to the role of substance abuse, a factor often sensationalized in Hollywood narratives but demanding rigorous clinical analysis in this context. In the ecosystem of late 20th century entertainment, narcotics and alcohol were rarely just tools for recreation. They were frequently utilized as industrial anesthesia. For an actor carrying the dual trauma of a closeted identity and a terminal, heavily stigmatized illness, the pressure was completely unmanageable without an escape valve. The politics of respectability he had learned in Memphis offered no tools for processing this level of terror. The Hollywood PR machine only demanded compliance, not offering psychological support. When a human being is trapped between the terrifying reality of a fatal disease and the absolute necessity of maintaining a flawless public facade to survive financially, numbing the mind becomes a primary survival instinct. If Riley engaged in substance use during this period, it must be viewed through the lens of profound psychological triage. It was an attempt to anesthetize the terror of the impending physical collapse and silence the paralyzing anxiety of being exposed by the tabloid press. However, the most chilling aspect of Riley's final years on Knots Landing was not the physical deterioration itself, but how the capitalist machinery of the network opted to utilize it. As the 1991 to 1992 television season approached, Riley's decline became impossible for the production team to ignore entirely. The heavy sweaters and the thick makeup were no longer sufficient to hide the reality that their leading man was severely ill. Faced with this undeniable visual evidence, the writers and producers made a stark, calculating decision. They did not halt production to allow their star to seek comprehensive palliative care. They did not write his character out of the show to grant him a dignified retirement. Instead, they weaponized his physical decay for ratings. Bound by the fabricated medical narrative that Riley and his team had provided to secure his insurance, the writer's room integrated the lie directly into the scripts. The character of Frank Williams was suddenly diagnosed with severe hypertension, leading to kidney failure. This creative decision crossed a terrifying ethical line. It blurred the boundary between fiction and a tragic unfolding reality. The network essentially monetized his dying process. Riley was handed scripts that required him to act out his own physical weakness, his own exhaustion, and his own impending mortality, but under the guise of a socially acceptable, non-threatening disease. The psychological torture of these scenes is difficult to overstate. When the director called action, Riley had to dig into his genuine, terrifying physical pain, but project it through the safe, sanitized filter of kidney disease. He was surrounded by cast members and a crew who were acting out concern for Frank Williams's kidneys, while Riley himself was secretly battling the defining plague of his generation. He was completely isolated in plain sight. He was experiencing the ultimate horror of the actor's craft. He was trapped in a scene he could not rewrite, playing a man dying of the wrong disease, knowing that the cameras capturing his performance were being used to sell soap, while his actual life slipped away. This was the absolute apex of the system's grip. The network had extracted every ounce of utility from his talent, his image, and now his very physical decline. He remained on the soundstage, delivering his lines with whatever breath he had left, ensuring the insurance premiums were paid, protecting his family from financial ruin, and enduring one of the most public and painful acts of self-erasure in broadcast history. The human body can only sustain a state of absolute physiological and psychological warfare for a limited time. By the spring of 1992, the agonizing performance on the set of Knots Landing reached its inevitable conclusion. Larry Riley's physical reserves were entirely depleted. He had successfully anchored the Williams family storyline, satisfied the network's demands, and most crucially, kept his health insurance active through the harshest stages of his illness. But the virus had progressed beyond the point where heavy makeup, layered clothing, and sheer willpower could mask the collapse of his immune system. He quietly exited the sound stages of CBS. There was no grand farewell. In the deeply uncomfortable, liability-obsessed culture of 1990s television production, terminal illness was handled with profound institutional silence. The cast and crew, many of whom had witnessed his harrowing physical decline firsthand, adhered strictly to the unwritten rules of Hollywood discretion. The cameras simply moved on to the next scene. Riley went home to Burbank, California, to face the final stages of the disease, away from the punishing glare of the studio lights. On June 6, 1992, Larry Riley passed away. He was just 2 weeks shy of his 40th birthday. In the immediate hours following a celebrity's death, a highly coordinated clinical mechanism is activated. The Hollywood public relations apparatus is not designed to process grief. It is designed to manage information and protect corporate assets. When Riley died, his representatives and the network's publicity department moved swiftly to execute the final phase of the lie they had all been maintaining for years. The press releases were drafted, finalized, and distributed to major news outlets. The official obituaries published in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and broadcast across entertainment news networks all echoed the exact same sanitized narrative. They praised his groundbreaking work on stage and television, celebrated his role as Frank Williams, and cited the cause of death as high blood pressure and renal failure. This immediate cover-up was an act of profound systematic erasure. Even in death, Riley was not permitted to step out of character. The establishment required his legacy to remain as non-threatening and palatable as the character he played. The motivation behind this post-mortem deception was driven by cold, hard economics. Knots Landing was not just a current broadcast asset. It was a highly valuable property destined for years of lucrative syndication. Reruns generate massive revenue for studios long after a show has ceased production. However, syndication relies on audience comfort. The network executives understood that if the public associated the comforting, stable character of Frank Williams with the terrifying, highly stigmatized reality of the AIDS epidemic, the syndication value of the show could plummet. Advertisers might pull back. The wholesome illusion would be shattered. Therefore, the lie regarding his death was strictly maintained to protect the commercial viability of his image. For the first few months following his passing, the official narrative held firm. The industry mourned the tragic premature loss of a talented actor to a common medical ailment. Riley's true identity, the specific nature of his suffering, and the immense quiet courage it took to endure his final years on set were buried alongside him. The system had successfully sanitized his death, just as it had aggressively sanitized his life. However, the architects of this erasure miscalculated the resolve of the person closest to the epicenter of the tragedy. Nina Riley had been the crucial linchpin in her husband's defensive strategy. As his wife, she had actively participated in maintaining the public illusion of the perfect traditional family to protect his career and their financial survival while he was alive. But with Larry gone, the dynamics of that survival contract radically shifted. The insurance had served its purpose. The career was over. The only thing left was the historical record. As 1992 progressed, the cultural conversation surrounding HIV and AIDS was slowly, agonizingly beginning to shift. In late 1991, Magic Johnson's explosive public disclosure of his HIV-positive status had forced a reluctant nation to acknowledge that the virus was not confined to marginalized groups. It was a catalyst that demanded a broader, more honest reckoning, particularly within the Black community, where the disease was spreading with devastating speed, but was still shrouded in profound denial and silence. Sitting in the aftermath of her husband's death, surrounded by a public narrative that was fundamentally false, Nina Riley reached a breaking point. Maintaining the lie of renal failure no longer protected Larry. It merely protected the discriminatory system that had forced him to suffer in silence. It reduced his harrowing final years to a sterile medical footnote, erasing the terrifying reality of what it meant to be a Black man dying of AIDS in Hollywood. In a courageous, definitive act of reclamation, Nina Riley chose to shatter the carefully constructed illusion. In late 1992, she granted an exclusive, highly detailed interview to Ebony magazine, the exact same publication that the PR machinery had previously used to heavily promote Riley's image as a traditional, wholesome family man. In the pages of Ebony, Nina Riley systematically dismantled the studio's official narrative. She publicly and unequivocally confirmed that her husband had died from AIDS-related complications. She spoke of the profound fear, the aggressive need for secrecy, and the immense toll the disease had taken on their family. She forcefully rejected the industry rumors regarding his sexuality or drug use, maintaining her stance on the origin of his infection. But her primary objective was clear. She refused to let his final performance be a corporate lie. This revelation sent a shockwave through the entertainment industry and the audiences who had welcomed Frank Williams into their homes for years. The sanitized, comfortable obituaries were suddenly rendered obsolete. The public was forced to confront the jarring disconnect between the man on the screen and the tragic hidden reality of his death. Nina Riley's decision to pull back the curtain was a monumental act of disruption. By outing the virus, she exposed the ruthless mechanics of the Hollywood closet. She revealed how the entertainment industry demanded absolute compliance, forcing artists to navigate a terminal diagnosis through a labyrinth of public relations fabrications. Her truth-telling ensured that Larry Riley's death would not just be recorded as a tragic loss of talent, but as a stark, damning indictment of an era that valued a marketable illusion far more than a human life. The lie was finally dead, but the devastating truths it left behind would force a reckoning that the industry could no longer ignore. Nina Riley's disclosure in Ebony magazine corrected the historical record, but it did not alter Hollywood's fundamental machinery. The entertainment industry absorbed the revelation with clinical detachment. There were no industry-wide symposiums on the pressures placed upon closeted black actors. The system simply tightened its non-disclosure agreements, secured the lucrative syndication rights for Knots Landing, and moved forward. However, Riley's death was not an isolated casualty of this era. It serves as a harrowing case study of a specific generational trauma, a pattern that becomes glaring when examined alongside the fate of his A Soldier's Story co-star, Howard E. Rollins Jr. In 1984, both men represented the absolute vanguard of black male acting talent. Just as Riley broke ground as the steady patriarch on CBS, Rollins achieved massive national prominence, playing the fiercely intelligent detective Virgil Tibbs on the hit series In the Heat of the Night. Both actors were hired by major networks to project an image of unshakable straight black masculinity and moral authority to mainstream audiences. Off-screen, they navigated the exact same lethal ecosystem, constrained by rigid morality clauses and stalked by the AIDS crisis. While Riley's defense mechanism was absolute compartmentalization, Rollins' internal fracture manifested publicly. He heavily utilized narcotics as a coping mechanism against the intense industry scrutiny. Factual records detail his 1988 arrest in Louisiana for cocaine possession, followed by a series of devastating DUIs in 1992 and 1993. These infractions resulted in jail time and ultimately cost him his starring television role. Industry insiders and biographers strongly suggest that Rollins, much like Riley, was a closeted man buckling under the weight of a heteronormative industry, using substance abuse as an anesthesia against the terrifying reality of the era. In December 1996, 4 years after Riley's passing, Rollins died in a New York hospital at the age of 46. The official cause of death was complications from lymphoma, a diagnosis widely recognized within the medical context of the mid-1990s as an AIDS-related condition. The dual loss of Riley and Rollins functions as a damning historical indictment. They had broken through the concrete ceiling of 1980s Hollywood, acquiring wealth and cultural influence. Yet the corporate demands placed upon them created an environment where seeking honest medical or psychological help equated to professional suicide. The studio system enforced a bleak calculus: hide your identity to protect your family's finances, or live openly and lose everything. To evaluate Larry Riley's legacy today requires separating his groundbreaking work from the ruthless machinery that employed him. His portrayal of Frank Williams undeniably humanized the black family dynamic for millions of viewers and widened the corridor for diverse casts on modern television. However, the historical record must permanently attach the human cost to that achievement. The network weaponized the morality of the era, extracting maximum labor from a dying man and demanding he lie about the illness killing him just to maintain his health insurance. For the demographic that grew up consuming 1980s and 1990s network television, the truth behind Larry Riley's life forces a retroactive reckoning with our nostalgia. We sought comfort in the fictional, affluent cul-de-sacs of primetime dramas, buying into the curated safety that the network sold without question. Decades later, watching a rerun of Knots Landing is no longer an exercise in simple escapism. The context has irrevocably changed. When the camera pushes in for a close-up on Frank Williams during those final seasons, the viewer is not looking at a fictional father dealing with high blood pressure. They are watching a real-time documentary of a man battling late-stage AIDS under hot studio lights, desperately acting for his physical survival and his medical coverage. The fiction dissolves, allowing the stark reality of the era to bleed directly through the screen. The pristine, morally uncomplicated entertainment of the late 20th century relied on a silent pact. The studios provided the fantasy, and the audience agreed not to look at the seams of the production. But those seams were held together by the immense sacrifices of the artists themselves. Actors trapped within this rigid system were not just performing scripts, they were executing high-stakes survival strategies. Larry Riley gave the public exactly what they demanded: the perfect neighbor, the steadfast father, and a flawless, non-threatening performance. The archived broadcast footage stands today as a permanent testament to his formidable skill, but it also serves as a haunting historical record. It is the undeniable evidence of an actor who was forced to endure a terminal disease in absolute silence, paying the ultimate price for his ticket of admission into the American living room.